Good morning, everyone. Since I'm out today, you'll be working through this lesson with me by video. Make sure you have your guided notes ready and actually stop to think, talk, or write when I ask you to. Today, we're continuing our study of Egyptian civilization by looking at religion, the afterlife, social organization, and Egyptian knowledge. We're going to begin with a quick activity about Egyptian tombs and what they can reveal about the people who created them. In this section, we will get ready for today's learning. Please take a few moments to prepare yourselves as we dive into the fascinating world of ancient Egypt. Let's start by considering what would a tomb reveal about Egyptian beliefs and daily life. If you were preparing a powerful ruler for the afterlife, which 3 items would you choose to include, and why? During this video, you will learn how religion shaped Egyptian government and daily life. You will also discover how Egyptian society was organized and identify the intellectual achievements that helped solve problems and preserve their history. To help us analyze historical evidence, we will now cover some key vocabulary. Understanding these terms is essential for our lesson today. First, mummification is the process Egyptians used to preserve a dead body by embalming and wrapping it. We will see why this mattered when we study the afterlife. Hieroglyphics were an Egyptian writing system that used pictures and symbols to represent sounds, objects, and ideas. Papyrus was a paper-like writing material made from a plant that grew along the Nile. Scribes used papyrus to record information, stories, and government records. 2 more terms. Decipher means to figure out the meaning of a code or unfamiliar form of writing. The Rosetta Stone eventually helped scholars decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. Radical means involving a major change from established beliefs or traditions. Akhenaten introduced a radical religious change when he promoted the worship of one god above the traditional gods. Keep these 5 terms in mind as we move through the lesson. Now, let's explore how religious beliefs shaped the Egyptian government and daily life. The pharaoh had 2 sources of authority. First, he was the political leader of Egypt. He made laws, directed the government, controlled land and taxes, oversaw major projects, and led Egypt in war and diplomacy. But the pharaoh was also a religious leader. Egyptians viewed him as a sacred ruler with a special connection between the gods and the Egyptian people. That combination made his authority especially powerful. Now follow the cause and effect sequence on the right. Egyptians believed the pharaoh had divine authority. Because of that belief, people were expected to obey him, and that obedience strengthened centralized government. In other words, obeying the pharaoh was not only political, it was connected to maintaining religious order and the favor of the gods. The key idea is that religion and government were closely connected in ancient Egypt. Religion also shaped ordinary Egyptian life. Amun-Re was connected to the sun, creation, and royal power. Osiris was associated with death, resurrection, and the afterlife. Isis was linked to family, protection, and healing. Hapi was connected to the Nile and its life-giving floods. Egyptians believed the gods controlled forces that affected survival, so families prayed, made offerings, followed traditions, and joined festivals. Quick check. Which god would farmers care about most, and why? Next, we will examine why Egyptians prepared so carefully for death. Egyptians believed death was a transition into another life, not the end of existence. They believed the spirit still needed the body, and that a successful afterlife depended on proper burial rituals and preparation. That explains the objects on the right: food, clothing, jewelry, tools, personal belongings, religious objects, and written prayers. These were not placed in tombs only to show wealth. Egyptians believed the dead might still need them in the afterlife. If the spirit needed the body in the afterlife, Egyptians needed a way to preserve it. First, embalmers prepared the body by removing organs and treating it. Next, the body was dried and preserved. Then, it was carefully wrapped in layers of linen. Finally, the mummy was placed in a coffin and tomb, often with objects meant for the afterlife. Mummification was therefore a religious process, not simply a burial technique. Tombs also protected more than the body. Coffins, paintings, written prayers, jewelry, tools, and other belongings survived inside them. Today, historians use this evidence to learn about Egyptian religion, family life, work, medicine, writing, art, and social status. Burial practices varied by wealth, so not every Egyptian received the elaborate treatment of a pharaoh. Think about it. What can a tomb reveal besides Egyptian beliefs about death? Tomb evidence also shows that wealth and status affected Egyptian life. That brings us to our next question. How was Egyptian society organized? Egypt had a social hierarchy, meaning people were arranged into levels with different amounts of power, wealth, and responsibility. As we look at the social pyramid, pay attention to two things: who held the most power, and which groups performed the work the civilization depended on. At the top of Egyptian society was the pharaoh, who served as both political and religious leader. Below him were officials, priests, and scribes who managed government, temples, taxes, and records. Next came artisans, merchants, and soldiers. They produced goods, conducted trade, and defended Egypt. Some people in these groups could gain wealth or status through specialized skill and service. At the bottom were peasants and laborers. They had little political power, but they made up the largest part of the population. Farmers produced most of Egypt's food, while laborers provided work and resources that supported the rest of society. So less power did not mean less importance. Egyptian society was unequal, but every level performed work the civilization depended on. Quick check. Why were peasants essential even though they had little political power? Social position affected daily life. Wealthier Egyptians generally had larger homes, finer clothing, more resources, and more elaborate burials. Peasants and laborers performed more physically demanding work and had fewer opportunities. Most Egyptians stayed close to the social position into which they were born. However, movement was not completely impossible. Education and specialized skills could create new opportunities. Becoming a scribe was one important path to greater status because literacy could lead to government service. Skilled artisans, merchants, soldiers, and officials could also gain wealth or influence through successful work or service. Egyptian women could own and inherit property, enter contracts, and seek divorce, although most women managed households. The key idea is that mobility was limited, but education, skill, trade, and service allowed some Egyptians to improve their position. Next, we will look at how Egyptian knowledge served to solve practical problems and preserve their civilization for posterity. Egyptians used several forms of writing for different purposes. Hieroglyphics used picture symbols and appeared on monuments, temples, and tombs. Hieratic and Demotic were simpler writing systems that made everyday communication and record-keeping faster. Egyptians also made papyrus from plants growing along the Nile, giving scribes a portable material on which they could write. Together, these systems made it much easier to record information. Scribes recorded taxes, government decisions, trade, property, legal agreements, religious beliefs, stories, and important events. Writing allowed Egypt to operate beyond the memory of a single person. Information could be stored, shared, and passed to future generations. That made writing important both to government and to history. Without written records, much of what Egyptians knew and experienced could have disappeared. Egyptian learning grew from real needs. In medicine, doctors examined injuries and illnesses and used treatments such as bandaging, medicines, and surgery. Knowledge gained through mummification also increased understanding of the human body. In astronomy, Egyptians observed the sun, stars, and the Nile's flood cycle. Those observations helped them develop a 365-day calendar that farmers could use to predict seasons and organize their work. Mathematics and geometry also solved practical problems. Officials measured land after Nile floods, builders calculated dimensions for temples and pyramids, and mathematics supported taxes, trade, irrigation, and construction. Notice the pattern at the bottom. Egyptians observed a problem, developed specialized knowledge, and then applied that knowledge to solve it. Quick check. Why would geometry become especially useful after the Nile flooded? Egyptian achievements did more than solve problems or display power. Architecture, art, and writing also preserved evidence. Temples, pyramids, and monuments expressed religious and political power and survived because of Egyptian engineering. Tomb paintings and statues showed gods, rulers, workers, family life, and celebrations. These images give historians visual evidence about Egyptian beliefs, values, and everyday life. Written records preserved prayers, stories, advice, laws, and accounts of important events. Together, buildings, artwork, and writing allow historians to study Egyptian civilization thousands of years later. Preserving civilization does not mean Egypt never changed. It means evidence survived that lets later generations understand it. Think about this. Which type of Egyptian achievement gives the clearest evidence of daily life, and why?
To conclude our lesson, think about everything we have covered today. Which of Egypt's legacies, their religion, social organization, or knowledge, do you believe was the most important? Reflect on your choice and support it with the evidence we have studied.